Controversial bills bouncing around the State House is just 18 yay votes away from the governor's desk. The Senate Judiciary and Rules Committee passed House Bill 406 onto the full chamber. That adds fentanyl to the list of drugs in Idaho carrying mandatory minimum punishment, which is now a good time for me and the camera to bring Andrew into this process.
Way to play off that.
Yeah, and has covered this bill all session. It's kind of touchy because it passed through the House Judiciary and Rules and Admin Committee without a recommendation, this bill did, which isn't a common thing to do. But mandatory minimum, taking judges' opinion out of the equation, that's one thing. But there's a secondary section of this bill that was talked about today, getting a little bit more pushback.
Yeah, and that without a recommendation, we're actually seeing that a bit this session, which is an interesting piece to me. But that other section of this, it's called drug-induced homicide. It's a clause that's sort of a bottom piece of this legislation. Now, we've previously reported the bill as it creates a new crime by that same name, drug-induced homicide, which is true. But in committee, Senator James Ruchti made it clear it's not just for fentanyl. If you give anyone a Schedule I drug that would include something like heroin, cocaine, and it kills that person you gave it to, even if it's an accident, regardless of intent, the bill wants to prosecute that as homicide. And former Ada County prosecutor Jean Fisher wants none of it. She says that targets the user, not the dealer, which is the intention of the main bill. It goes against the rest of the bill to target traffickers. She says it's red tape at best, but more likely it's meaningless and confusing.
In the conversations that I have had, even with some of the law enforcement officers I've talked to, even one prosecutor that I talked to, when I asked, why do we want this drug-induced homicide? Why? And routinely, they have all said, yeah, we're never going to use this bill, and causation is really hard to prove. And it's a terrible thing to do, to be in a situation, to have that grieving parent come to you, begging for you to do something when you know that you can't or you won't. And they already know that right now. And so do most of you.
Fisher adds involuntary manslaughter. It's already on the books right now in state law, and it already covers a death linked to bad drugs like an overdose, or it could be used for that. It makes this session of the bill unnecessary. Again, that's according to Fisher. Now, the main portion of the bill is strictly about creating mandatory minimums for fentanyl. In one word, supporters call it a deterrent. We hear that recurring. Now, 3 lawmakers who opposed the bill in testimony sort of hung up on this term intent. If you have enough drugs, you are considered a trafficker under mandatory minimums. Police do not need to prove your intent to sell. They say the amount alone is sufficient. That's what this law would agree with and put into law. Now, this is when the room got hot. Testimony on behalf of human trafficking victims, I should say. She says this bill would also target victims of human trafficking. She says it would drop the hammer on those people who need help and compassion.
Drug trafficking and human trafficking are interconnected. Victims of human trafficking will become more involved in the drug markets, typically playing low-level, nonviolent roles, and they will be the last link in the system that ultimately will be the individuals that will be penalized as the unintended consequences of these harsh laws.
So if someone who's trapped in human trafficking gets arrested, is that an opportunity for them to break out of that system, maybe to get some help? But if they're charged with a mandatory minimum, that opportunity isn't presented to them?
It's really about the intent, right? And the judges making that decision to, one, identify a victim, law enforcement giving them the tools to identify victims. They are more scared than law enforcement than their own traffickers.
I'm offended by that statement. That's the last thing we do. There may have been a day in the past when sex trafficking was considered a vice crime. Those days are long gone. If they're a victim, they're a victim, and we treat them as a victim, and we do everything we can to give them the opportunity to get out of that, to get away from the abuser, the trafficker, the controller, get them into programs, and get them to a safe spot. If these people have to do some time, we pray and hope they get the programming they deserve in prison. Sometimes it's kind of harsh, but the harsh reality is if you don't do that, they stay out there until either they die or they kill someone else.
So a big piece of that, Canyon County Sheriff Kieran Donahue, his county does a good job compared to the other counties in the state in terms of managing human trafficking, finding that crime and prosecuting it as such. But a good piece, I can't remember the lawmaker that said it, or maybe it was in testimony, we make laws for the bad acting types. the lowest common denominator, not for the exemplary ones. And so there might be police departments where that isn't the case.
Okay.
So that was kind of the argument put forth. But regardless, 6-3, it passed. It's moving to the Senate floor, one step away from the governor's desk.
Did it pass with or without or with no recommendation?
I believe it was no recommendation.
So again, it's held true that this one's going forward without a recommendation from either committee.
We'll double check on that. If we're
Okay.
wrong, we'll correct it at the end of the show.
All right.